In analyzing the cultural dynamics of the 19th century Italy, the role of cultural promoters has often been relegated to the background. They were not artists to cure, but intellectuals with a wide range of skills, capable of fostering connections, supporting creative paths, and circulating ideas. It was thanks to them, especially in the second half of the century, that a lively and stimulating context developed, giving rise to many of the highest artistic expressions of the time. It was these men and women, driven by refined culture and a fervent civic commitment, we made possible the creation of work that we now consider cornerstones of our cultural heritage. Often without official roles or public recognition, cultural promoters were multilingual, had a deep knowledge of music and the visual arts, cultivated libraries and collections, and above all were founders or members of the most vibrant intellectual circles of their time. Their role was recognize talent, foster contacts, promote innovative ideas, and act as a bridge between creativity and society. Among the most emblematic examples, it is impossible not to mention the role of the Ricordi family in Milano, which contributed decisively to the production and dissemination of the opera music, supporting composer, editing publication, and promoting encounters between artists and librettists. Milano, at that time, was a crossroads of intellectual activity. Saloons, academies, and conversation circles were veritable cultural laboratories where romantic thought was shaped and disseminated. This was not an exclusively Italian trend, but one of that involved the whole of 19th century Europe. From Paris to London, Berlin to Vienna, art was tangled with philosophy, literature, music, and politics. However, in this article, we will focus especially on the Italian situation and on emblematic events that show how these intellectual networks played a decisive role in the creation of a complex and fascinating works such as Giuseppe Verdi, La Forza del Destino. A particularly rich of significant example of this dynamic is offered by Maffei Saloon in Milano. Founded and animated by Countess Clara Maffei, the saloon was in an intellectually effervescent, liberal and open environment. Patriots, artists, poets, and philosophers met here to discuss freedom, aesthetics, politics, and culture. But the Maffei Saloon was not just a place for conversation. It was a veritable cultural workshop where new romantic ideas gained strength and took shape in a concrete projects. In this context of fervor, art was not confined to idealistic abstraction but became the vehicle of value and a concrete manifestation of ethical and civil tension. Fortunately, Italy at that time was rich and an artist capable of translating these ideas into visual, musical, and theatrical works. The saloon thus became not only a place for debate, but also a hotbed of plays giving rise to text, compositions, paintings, and plays that were to mark an era. In the case we are examining, we are faced with the long and complex journey of an idea, or rather a work, which has its roots in post-Napoleonic France, passed through Romantic Spain, becomes part of the Italian fabric of the early 19th century and finally culminates in international acclaim in St. Petersburg. This is the journey of Don Alvaro o La Fuerza del Sino, a drama by Spanish poet Ángel de Saavedra, Duke of Rivas, which after many changes as postponements was to become the libretto for Giuseppe Verdi's opera La Forza del Destino. Ángel de Saavedra was one of the most important figures of Spanish Romanticism. In 1823, with the absolutist restoration of Ferdinand VII and the repression of the so-called liberal triennium, 1820 to 1823, he was condemned to exile for his liberal political idea and his poetic and theatrical activity, which were at odds with the Restoration ideology. During his exile, the Duke did not limit himself to seeking refuge. He traveled to England and Malta, where he encountered the great dramatic tradition of Shakespeare and the poetry of Byron, and where he developed a literary sensibility with similar to that of the European Romantics. His travels also took him to France, where he lived in Paris twice, in close contact with the literary circles animated by Victor Hugo, who profoundly influenced his style. It was in France between 1830 and 1833 that Rivas composed one of his most important plays, El Moro Exposito. This is considered one of the manifesto texts of Spanish Romanticism. The revolutionary power of this work lay not only in its plot or characters, but above all in its preface, written by Antonio Galiano, which was the veritable manifesto of Romantic poetics and ideology. This preface was read and followed by an entire generation of artists and intellectuals who recognized in it the perfect synthesis of the new values of the time, the exaltation of sentiment, tragic heroism, and opposition to the dogmas of classicism. The political situation in Spain changed significantly in 1834 with the death of Ferdinand VII. This event made it possible for many exiles to return to their homeland. The new political openness, notwithstanding partial and temporary, allowed Rivas not only to return in his homeland but also to be reinstated in the ranks of power. So between 1843 and 1850, he was appointed ambassador of the Kingdom of Spain to the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies and Naples. During his stay in Italy, Rivas brought him his intellectual experience and his works, which began to circulate more widely in the Italian cultural context. It is important to remember that in the 19th century, the circulation of ideas predictably passed through translations. Among the best-known translators of Spanish work was Faustino Sanseverino, an Italian intellectual who was deeply involved in the cultural circles at the time. Sanseverino became passionate about Riva's work and devoted himself to translating La Fuerza del Sino, that is already known in Italy since at least 1843. During a trip to Naples around 1845, Sanseverino managed to meet Rivas himself and submit the translated text to him, obtaining permission to modify the Italian content under the author's supervision. These translations, which was approved in some way, notwithstanding not formally by Ribas, is one of the few examples of the practice of the time in which an author directly suggested changes to a translation and approved its content. Although the translation was already complete in 1845, its publication was postponed for another 5 years, and it was not published until 1850. In a preface of the volume, Sanseverino justified this delay without explaining the reasons. It is likely that the content of the work, laden with political and moral references in line with the European liberalism, was considered problematic by the censorship still active in many Italian states, or that the reasons were related to personal or editorial motivations. It was therefore in 1850, when it was published by Vallardi Edition, that Don Alvaro began to spread, particularly in Milano, and began to circulate among writers, musicians, and booksellers. It was in Milano that the cultural conditions were created through word of mouth circles, which brought Rivas' work to the right place, from which Verdi drew inspiration in the future when choosing the subject for his new opera. During those years, Giuseppe Verdi was busy with new theatrical productions and collaborated assiduously with some of the most important Italian librettists. Among them was Antonio Somma, with whom Verdi has collaborated on Un ballo in maschera. Somma was well connected in Lombard intellectual circles and was a frequent visitor to the Maffei Saloon. The Maffei Saloon was an extraordinary cultural crossroads. Led by the Countess Clara Maffei, a patron of the arts and interlocutor of artists such as Francesco Hayez. It was a meeting point for various disciplines and a driving force for new ideas. But it was the Countess' husband, Andrea Maffei, who played a crucial role in the story we are reconstructing. A poet, translator, and refined intellectual, Andrea Maffei was a tireless promoter of culture, convinced that the art could carry the new values of the time: freedom, individuality, and opposition to oppressive governments. Maffei believed deeply in the role of the culture as an instrument of change. His activities were not limited to patronage. He was also the creator and the mediator of concrete projects, such as the one featuring a young composer from Trentino, called Vincenzo De Lutti. It was Maffei himself who organized a meeting between De Lutti and Antonio Somma so that they could collaborate on the writing of a new melodrama. The first subject proposed was Victor Hugo's Faust. However, the idea quickly fell through as another Italian theater was already preparing a version of the same drama. The overlap would have compromised the reception of the work. The project was therefore shelved. It was not uncommon in the history of opera to see several parallel attempts to set the same subject onto music. Just think of the story of the three poemas, Puccini, Leoncavallo, and Massenet. Towards the end of 1858, Maffei and Somma resumed their dialogue in search for a new subject. In 1859, Angel de Saavedra's Don Alvaro was proposed. De Lutti accepted enthusiastically. Riva's work seemed the perfect subject, dense with pathos, infused with romantic ideals, laden with implicit political meanings. It is likely that Maffei had come across the text during a stay in Naples, where he had roomed in the same building as the Sanseverino family, with whom he had spent many convivial evenings. Reading Riva's work convinced him that Don Alvaro offered a unique opportunity for an artistic and cultural endeavor consistent with the values promoted by the Maffei Saloon. Alas, this attempt also failed. The main reasons were practical. Antonio Somma claimed to be overworked and suffering from many health problems, but I think the most serious of which was probably his reluctance, and managed to write only a few pages of the libretto, which is sent to the composer. The slow skip of writing downcast De Lutti, who was excited to make his debut as soon as possible, and urged by his mother, he accepted an alternative proposal. Thus once again, Don Alvaro returned to the rest among his papers and the unfinished project. Why Don Alvaro was once again shelved, Giuseppe Verdi was at a particular stage in his career. This was the period between 1860 and 1861, a time marked by great political confusion in Italy. Although he tried to stay away from institutional positions, Verdi was elected deputy of the new formed Italian parliament. As is well known, he was never a professional politician, not particularly enthusiastic about parliamentary life, but out of a sense of civic duty and Risorgimento spirit, he accepted the rule and took it so seriously. This political interlude, however, was not without effects. Verdi himself confessed in some letters that he was neglecting his true calling and felt he was losing touch with his creative streak. In the meantime, he also devoted himself with a great passion to renovating his agricultural properties, especially the Sant'Agata estate, which he considered a sort of refuge from public life. For him, agriculture was much more than a sideline. It was a true vocation. In the spring of 1861, an unexpected letter arrived at his residence. It was from Mauro Corticelli, private secretary to the actress Adelaide Ristori, who was on tour in Russia at the time. This was followed by a second letter signed by the singer Enrico Tambornik, who was then artistic director of the Imperial Theatre in St. Petersburg. The invitation was clear. The theatres were looking for a great European composer for a new opera to be performed in the 1861-1862 season. It was a prestigious, well-paid opportunity, and above all, it gave the musician complete freedom to choose the subject matter. It was an attractive offer, but Verdi did not seem enthusiastic at first. He was too involved in political and administrative life, too absorbed by family and agricultural matters, too far removed from the inspiration needed for a new masterpiece. Giuseppina Strepponi mediated between the parties, once again acting as interpreter and curator of the maestro's artistic needs. Giuseppina was not only a woman of culture, but also a trusted advisor, an attentive promoter, and a diplomatic mediator in her husband's relationships. It was she who replied to Corticelli, assuring him that he should do everything possible to bring Verdi back to the music. It did not take much persuasion. The proposal was interesting, and the city of St. Petersburg offered an unique opportunity. The Russian public was cultured, attentive, and open to the European innovation. The idea of composing an opera with complete freedom of subject matter in an international setting restored Verdi's interest. Perhaps there was also a more ordinary financial interest, given the recent expenses for the complete renovation of his home. So he proposed a subject inspired by one of his favorite authors, Victor Hugo. In particular, it turned to Ruy Blas, a drama full of moral tension and civil passion. Unfortunately, shortly afterwards, a telegram arrived from St. Petersburg informing him that Ruy Blas had been rejected. Perhaps considered too infused with the liberal values, it was deemed unfitting for performance in the theatre of Tsar Alexander II. Verdi, disappointed but not entirely close to the negotiation, hinted that he would accept another subject, but only if we consider it valid and stimulating. Otherwise, no contract would be signed. The Imperial Theatre's entourage was clearly determined to hire Verdi at any cost. The singer Tamberlik's brothers, Achille, was also involved and traveled to Italy in person to find a solution. The goal was clear: to propose a subject that was acceptable to the Russian government but capable of arousing Verdi's interest. At this point, the story takes on the tone of a cultural treasure hunt. It is said that for weeks, friends and supporters of composers searched for a suitable drama. Novels, tragedies, and forgotten libretto were consulted. It is said that Verdi himself went to Torino in search of possible choices. It was in this climate of fervent research that Rivas Don Alvaro re-emerged, as if from a long closet driver. However, it is not difficult to imagine that behind this rediscovery was once again the figure of Andrea Maffei. In fact, the Milanese setting, so rich in connection and memories, had kept alive the knowledge of that work and its possible musical transposition. This time, however, fate seemed more favorable. Verdi, stimulated by challenge and freedom offered by the Russian project, accepted the subjects. It was June 1861. The decision was made. Verdi began work on the new opera, which would be titled La Forza del Destino. Rivas' original text already contained all the elements of the great melodrama: foiled love, guilt and forgiveness, the fatality of change, the knitting of individual drama and collective destiny. But there was much more: the guilt that haunts the protagonist, the metaphysical anguish, the implicit reference to the romantic ideology of destino as inevitable fate. All these elements spoke deeply to Verdi, who set to work with intensity and rigor. As is well known, the composer was very demanding in his choice of librettists. The choice fell on Francesco Maria Piave. Although Verdi, which was not all unusual, was not entirely satisfied. Verdi used it to intrude personally in the text, suggesting changes, adding passages, and sometimes rewriting entire sections. He wanted something more refined in certain parts of his new creation, and they reconsidered involving Andrea Maffei, asking him if he would like to adapt some of his poetic translations from Schiller for this new opera. The idea was to enrich the musical text with more elevated linguistic and ideological inserts. La Forza del Destino was completed and performed for the first time at the Imperial Theatre in St. Petersburg on November 10, 1862. The reception was warm and the opera was a great success. One of the very few who was unconvinced was Giuseppe Verdi himself. Perhaps the short time he had taken to compose it made him feel that the opera as it stood did not do justice to the depth of the subject, with the result that in the following years he proceeded to substantially revise the score and the libretto. The new versions produced in collaboration with Antonio Ghislanzoni, the future librettist of Aida, and it was performed at La Scala in 1869. The 1869 new revision was much more than a simple musical working. It represented the realization of an artistic ideal that Verdi had begun pursuit for years. Ghislanzoni demonstrated a remarkable ability to adapt dramatic text to a complex and coherent musical structure. With his contribution, the opera gained greater formal balance, a more defined narrative clarity, and a dramatic refinement that was partly lacking in the Russian version. The changes were several. Some parts were reorganized. The structure of the prologue was changed. The role of the female protagonist was wired, and the ending was redefined. The latter went from a tragic and fatalistic conclusion to a more moral solution inspired by regret and spiritual salvation. The very concept of the force of destiny, which in Riva's original text represented the predictability of fate, was re-explained by Verdi in a more humanistic way, no longer blamed fatalism but also individual responsibility, the possibility of redemption, and an inner conflict between guilt and forgiveness. The 1869 version is the one most frequently performed today in theaters around the world. La Forza del Destino is one of the most beloved, most discussed, and most emotionally charged works in Verdi repertoire.